Okay, welcome everyone to the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. My name is Danny Kuan. I'm Dean of the school. Now, just very quickly, before we begin with the main event, just to run through, we're going to have a public lecture delivered for about 35, 40 minutes, depending. But the speaker has very kindly agreed to have a question and answer session after the lecture. I have been told to remind you, I will do so again. This session is being recorded. So other people would like to participate in this as well after the session. So I want to make sure, therefore, that when you ask your question in the Q&A, to turn on the microphone in front of you and speak into it so that it will be recorded properly. Okay. So on to the event. So this evening, we're delighted to welcome back to the school, Mr. Klaus Regling, Managing Director of the European Stability Mechanism and CEO of the European Financial Stability Facility. Mr. Regling's record as international public servant can only be admired for how varied and how widely he has worked. He began, we were just discussing, in Washington, D.C. at the International Monetary Fund in the mid-1980s. And at IMF, he has worked at the fund's research department and African department and represented IMF both within the United States in Washington, D.C., as well as internationally, including somewhere in the mix, Jakarta, Indonesia, right here next to us in Singapore. But even after and outside IMF, Klaus continued his international traversal of the world, notably Africa and Asia, including stints in leadership roles at the Asian Development Bank and at the Inter-African Development Bank. Back in Europe itself, in between these different times, Klaus naturally served critical roles in a variety of places, including obviously the German Ministry of Finance, where he led on Germany's European and international monetary and international financial relations. While there, Klaus was a key driver behind writing what became known subsequently as the Stability and Growth Pact, a set of guidelines designed to guide fiscal discipline for Eurozone membership. With the maturing of the European Union, it was only natural that after those decades that I've just described, Klaus took on a pan-European Union leadership role in Brussels, notably as Director for Economic and Financial Affairs at the European Commission. You will notice that throughout these decades, and given his work choices, it is no surprise that Klaus has seen more than his fair share of crises. Among them, the 1980s Latin American debt crisis, the 1997 Asian financial crisis, right here in East Asia, the 2008 global financial crisis, the 2010 Eurozone sovereign debt crisis. Indeed, it seemed like Klaus could not get enough of having to deal with crises at the very height of financial concerns in Europe. And about just the era's most fraught moment, Klaus agreed to become inaugural CEO of the European Financial Stability Facility, what the Economist newspaper rather irreverently called Europe's offshore special purpose vehicle. Klaus has promised that he can spend a second or two rebutting the implications of such a claim by the Economist newspaper. But what the EFSF sought to do, it was built to lend to Europe's economies at financial risk. It did that by drawing on financial guarantees from the extremely creditworthy Eurozone nations. Since this job, being inaugural CEO of the EFSF, didn't quite stretch enough of Klaus's bandwidth, he subsequently also became the inaugural managing director of the European Stability Mechanism, a Eurozone intergovernmental organization designed to deal with financial crises and to ensure long-term financial stability and prosperity. Klaus brings to that job, as well as to our presentation this evening, both battle scars and battle experience, as today, all of us obviously continue to confront ongoing crises, pandemic, geopolitical, rather than purely financial. Klaus is the man to talk to us about this. Now, you'll notice that earlier I quickly said, welcome back to Klaus, rather than just welcome. And that is because despite the frenetic pace of international public service that he has undertaken in his time, he also managed to spend a year in what he said he had hoped would be quiet reflection right here at our Lee Kuan Yew School. That year, however, turned out to be 2008, which was the year of the global financial crisis, when Europe and all of Asia were worried about what was going to happen to the global economy. I think you'll agree that there is no one better placed to talk to us this evening on the topic. Please join me in welcoming back Klaus to the school for his lecture to us on Europe's growing resilience to crises. Klaus, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Danny, and good evening to all of you. Good afternoon, good evening. It's indeed a pleasure to be back. I had a very, very interesting year here in 2008 and 9 and came back a few times. But the last time I think was in 2016. You were there and helped me with the presentation at the time. Indeed, I will talk about crises that are particularly important to Europe. So I will not talk about the Latin American debt crisis, not about the Asian crisis, but I will talk about the 4 crises that were particularly important for Europe. And I hope you don't come to the conclusion that wherever I go, there's another crisis. It could look like that, but the task was to fight the crisis. So I will talk about Europe, and that's why I want to start with a little bit of background. I know many of you know it, but maybe not all the details and not all of you. So in Europe, we have the European Union, 27 member states. The UK dropped out a few years ago. A few other countries want to join, like on the Balkan, countries like Albania, Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina. There's now talk about Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova joining, but this is a long, difficult process. A few countries are not in the EU, like the UK, they dropped out, also Switzerland and Norway, they are not a member, but all the others are 27, and it has been a long, long process. It started in 1952 when 6 countries created the first European institution. It was called European Coal and Steel Community. And 1952, you have to remember that was 7 years after World War II. So the idea was very much to work together on products that are essential if you want to go into war, coal and steel. Without that, particularly in those years, one cannot have a war. So to bring together particular countries like France and Germany that had their share of wars, that was a really decisive step and has to be seen against that background of many wars. Since then, the European, what we call now European Union, developed from 6 countries to 27. And we created a single market for workers, goods, capital, and services. ASEAN countries are also in that process of creating a single market. And I think that's very encouraging because it's really good for economic developments. Um, certain areas, in certain areas, we do have common policies that are decided at the EU level, EU for European Union, like in trade. When there are trade agreements, the European Commission negotiates on behalf of 27 member states. Agriculture, such a policy, regional developments, but many areas are still national. So we are not the United States of Europe, but we are more than just 27 sovereign states. It's somewhere in between. It's important to understand that there are four bodies that are key for the functioning of the European Union. There's the Council, that's where the ministers meet on a regular basis from the different member states, and also the heads of state and government. Then it's a summit, but still a council. We have the European Commission as an independent body that works for the interests of the entire EU. There's a European Parliament. They don't have that much to say, but on certain items, particularly when we deal with a common policy like trade and agriculture, then they have an important say and no longer the national parliaments. And also very important, there's the European Court of Justice. And that is key to make sure that there's really the same interpretation of law applied in all member states. That is really a big shift in sovereignty, that member states agreed to that court. They don't have the last word on everything, but in those areas that are common policies, again, trade, agriculture, if there is a dispute, they have the last say, no longer national constitutional courts. So that's the European Union. And as a subset of countries, 19, they form the Economic and Monetary Union. They use the euro as their legal tender. Monetary Union is the result of a long integration process. Monetary Union started in 1999. Euro notes and coins were introduced in 2002, so only 20 years ago. But the monetary union, the euro, would not be imaginable if there had not been an important integration process first, where economic policies and economic convergence was achieved. One cannot have one currency for so many countries. Think of ASEAN. If ASEAN, some people think ASEAN should move in that direction. And I did some research on that when I was here 12 years ago, 13 years ago. And I think without this integration process first, which is very useful in itself, but without that, one cannot make that step, then one really runs into problems. So it was only possible because we had integration since 1952, basically. Therefore, one could dare to go into this big experiment of having one currency for all the countries. And there were many steps in between. Some of you who study these areas may know that in 1971, the Bretton Woods system in its initial form came to an end, where every currency was pegged to gold and the dollar, and currencies started floating, flexible exchange rates. And Europe always tried to limit the flexibility of these exchange rates because they were not good for trade. So there were many attempts, and slowly it led to the situation that one could have a common currency. So we started in 1999 with 11 countries. Today there are 19 member states. And the monetary union will continue to grow next year. Very likely Croatia will join, one EU member state that is not yet using the euro. But they are probably meeting all the criteria, and then we will be 20 countries, and others will probably follow. So it's a long development, and again, we are somewhere in between a collection of sovereign national states and the United States of Europe. We are somewhere in the middle, and that makes it unique and also leads to many problems. if we were the United States of Europe, my life would be a lot easier. My institution wouldn't exist because that would be then handled by one government. But we don't have that. So that is the background. This is still on monetary union. Yeah, maybe some important facts. We have one central bank. That's an important characteristic of the monetary union. One monetary policy, one exchange rate policy. But the fiscal and economic policies are still ultimately done at the national level. And that can, of course, lead to conflicts. But that's why we need coordination mechanisms. And you mentioned the Stability and Growth Pact. That's one on fiscal policy. We also have coordination procedures for other policies. So we try to deal with this tension of having a centralized monetary policy, decentralized economic policies. Some particular US academics told us in the 90s this will never work. And the answer is it can work if we coordinate well. And sometimes we have coordinated well and sometimes not so well. So that's the background. Now let's talk about the four crises. The global financial crisis, 2008 and 9, when I was here at the Lee Kuan Yew School. Then the Euro crisis soon after that. Then you all remember the COVID-19 pandemic. And right now we have to deal with the consequences of the war in Ukraine. Actually, I gave 2 lectures at the Lee Kuan Yew School about the first 2 crises. When I was here, I gave a lecture on the global financial crisis in 2009. And in 2016, I gave a lecture, and you were here, you helped me, on the Euro crisis and how we were getting out. By 2016, one could already draw a resume, how we did it, what we learned, what mistakes we made, what were the lasting improvements in the management of monetary union. But I will, because I realize you were all not here at the time, I will briefly talk about all of that and then about the third and the fourth crisis. So the first one, global financial crisis, was triggered in the United States. In the US housing market, there were, it's often called the subprime crisis. US banks gave loans and securitized the loans without really doing their due diligence. Creditworthiness was not really assessed. But there were other problems, that liquidity had been too generous for too long. But those are the causes. I will come to that. So first on the overview, it triggered in the US, it spread around the world, affected most countries, also Singapore. There were bankruptcies of major crises. You all heard probably Lehman went bankrupt in September 2008. So the trust in the banking sector declined. All that led to a credit crunch, which then had a negative effect on the economy as a whole. And the world GDP actually dropped for the first time since World War I. Not much, minus 0.1%, but compared to a normal growth of world GDP of around, at the time, 5%, that was a big drop. And it was the first negative number we saw. In the euro area, the drop in GDP was much bigger, but also trend growth in Europe is lower because it's a mature economy. So in the euro area, there was minus 4.5% drop in GDP. So a real crisis, but also in Japan and many other countries of the world. What caused all of that? As already said briefly, too generous monetary policy, nominal real interest rates were too low for too long. That resulted in a search for yield. Search for yield sounds harmless, but can be very bad, because then people start investing with low risk aversion into high risk assets without doing the appropriate risk assessment. But also at the same time, we came out of a period of excess consumption in the US with very large trade and current account deficits, excess savings in Asia, particularly in China, which led to large current account surpluses in many Asian countries. Bank supervision was very weak. there was an attitude among central banks and supervisors in those years that the markets would be smart enough to regulate themselves. Alan Greenspan, the head of the Federal Reserve at the time, said many times, the markets will know what to do in order not to get into a crisis. A few years later, he apologized for that statement. It was clearly wrong. Markets are not that smart, or they only look at their narrow interests and don't look at the overall picture. Today, we talk about macroprudential policies, a term that did not exist in the 90s. It was then invented to make clear that supervisors had to look at the overall macro picture, not only loan by loan in a bank book, but really take an overall view to discover risks early on. There were new instruments developed that did not exist before the 90s because the computers were too weak, didn't have the power to develop certain financial instruments. So many reasons for the crisis. Also, rating agencies failed and gave the AAA ratings too easily to financial products. Then what did we do? When the crisis hit, the world economy dropped, as I said, slightly negative growth in 1 year, very unusual. So the central banks had to ease their policies, although they had eased too much already the 10 years before, but at that moment there was no alternative. Governments used fiscal instruments to stimulate demand. That was also appropriate in such a crisis. Private sector companies, banks had to be bailed out. Some banks went bankrupt, also private sector companies went bankrupt, but one cannot let all banks go bankrupt because then the economy doesn't work any longer. So if there's nobody else to help, the government has to step in. It means more public debt then, so not good, but unavoidable. And these were the heydays of good global policy coordination. The G20, which had been created a little bit earlier, but not much earlier, became very active. Earlier, they had met at finance ministers level. They started to meet at heads of state level. And they really took the lead to design a response to this global financial crisis. And of course, the European Union participated. They are a member of the G20. G20 is 20 countries, but also the EU as a full participant representing its 27 member states. Importantly, then the financial oversight was strengthened, bank regulation was strengthened. The idea was that every participant in financial markets and every product that was sold in financial markets had to be strictly supervised in order to avoid such a crisis for the future. Also, credit rating agencies, I mentioned them as one of several reasons for the crisis, are since then under much tighter regulation. So supervisors also check what they are doing. So quite a number of responses, and some of these responses are lasting improvements in the global financial system, like better regulations for banks and rating agencies that continues. This is in place and helped also in subsequent years to deal with other crises. Let's move to the next one. The Euro crisis, 2009-13, was a real European crisis. The first one, global financial crisis, is easy to blame on the United States, although other factors played a role as well, but mainly US. This is really Europe. And within Europe, the Euro area. So countries outside the Euro area in Europe had not much to do with it. Here, it became very clear that during the first decade of monetary union, and in 2009, monetary union was 10 years old only. So it was really during the infancy of the monetary union. During that decade, several countries had too lax policies. They lost competitiveness, incomes, salary, wages, pensions increased too fast, much faster than productivity. They had, some of them, high levels of debt, large fiscal deficits. And financial markets that are often fairly careless and don't react initially. Once they react very forcefully. So when all these problems became known, a number of countries lost market access. They could not get any money anymore in the market. And that it started in Greece, but very quickly spilled then over to Portugal, Ireland, and later on to Spain and Cyprus. And that affected then the entire euro area. Euro area GDP declined by 1.1% in 2012 and 13, and was also already very weak in 2010 and 11. The causes, again, lax policies, but also there was weak coordination of policies at the EU level. I talked earlier about the concept of monetary union, where monetary policy is completely centralized. Other policies are done at the national level. So one needs to coordinate well, and that coordination was not good enough. But also, again, banking supervision was not the way it should be and continued to be done until then at the national level. So in that area, there was not much coordination. Macroprudential supervision did not happen at the European level. And the last point is important for my institution. There was no lender of last resort for sovereigns. What does that mean? When you have one country and one central bank, let's say United Kingdom today, if there's a crisis, the central bank is a lender of last resort for banks. That's true in every country. But when there's a real crisis, the central bank also becomes the lender of last resort for the government, for the sovereign. In the monetary union, we don't have that because the European Central Bank is not allowed to finance fiscal deficits directly in the member states, because that would mean shifting resources from one country to another. And that was not allowed under the Maastricht Treaty. But so we were there without having anybody who could help except the International Monetary Fund, who does that at the international level. But there, the resources of the IMF were far too small to help a country like Greece. This is still on the sources of the crisis. Let's only look at the left-hand chart because it underlines well, I think, a point I made. I said countries lost competitiveness. What does it mean? If you look at the dark blue line, that's Greece, and shows how Greek nominal unit labor costs developed from 2000 on cumulative. And you see they went from 100 to 150. The light gray line at the bottom, that's Germany, but stands basically for Northern Europe. And you see that at the beginning of the Euro crisis in 2009-10, the unit labor costs in Greece had increased 45% more than in Northern Europe within a decade. And that's why they lost competitiveness. The current account deficit became huge, 15% of GDP. And when you have a current account deficit of 15% of GDP, it means you need to import capital every year, equivalent to 15% of GDP, to finance that deficit. And for a while, markets were willing to do that. But when they saw these problems, they stopped doing it. And that's when Greece didn't know what to do. That's when we had to create the EFSF, the institution I was asked to create at that time. It didn't exist before. It was a gap in the architecture of the monetary union. But when I look more systematically what brought us out of the Euro crisis, there are 5 points. The first one is that the countries really did the necessary adjustment. So looking again at Greece, and we can go back to the slide, you see that the unit labor cost dropped. The dark blue line after 2011 really came down quite dramatically. And that was achieved because nominal wages, salaries, and pensions were cut by 30%. It's something we call real internal devaluation. This is something that, according to economic textbooks, does not happen. because even textbooks that I use today, I've talked to some of the authors, and they hopefully will change it one day. People thought wages cannot fall in nominal terms. They can fall in real terms through higher inflation, but that escape route is not possible in a monetary union because inflation is more or less the same in all countries. So you cannot have in a country that lost competitiveness all of a sudden have a jump in inflation so that it regains competitiveness. That's not possible. That can be achieved by a devaluation of a national currency, but Greece didn't have a national currency. So the only way out, quick way out, and it works, is to say, well, civil servants from next month get 30% less than they got up to last month. Very painful, nobody likes it. Lots of demonstrations in Athens and in Lisbon and in Dublin, where it happened to a small extent, but it worked. And countries also implemented reforms to improve competitiveness, to reduce fiscal deficits, and so on. And if they had not done that, we would have never gotten out of the crisis. The second point is unconventional monetary policy by the ECB. So the European Central Bank stepped in, did things that normally a central bank doesn't do, quantitative easing, and that was very helpful at the time. But the Financial Times often writes that Mario Draghi, who was the president at the time, he rescued the euro, and that's only half the truth. He played an important role, but first, if the countries had not done the adjustment, we would still be in a crisis. And also the other points are important. So they played their role, very important, to calm down markets, but it was not only them. We also broadened the macroeconomic surveillance and deepened this with new instruments. We started what we call banking union, where new institutions were created that today are in charge at the European level to supervise the 120 systemically important banks in Europe. That was a big step that was not possible to do in the 90s when we designed monetary union. It's an example, things are possible in a crisis that are not possible before. And the last point is about the two institutions that I manage, EFSF, ESM, because we then, I built them from scratch, they didn't exist, and we had to help 5 countries. This is a quick summary, I will not go into details, but 5 countries, Greece, Portugal, Ireland, Spain, and Cyprus, several programs for Cyprus. Altogether, we dispersed 295 billion euro to these 5 countries. Greece got the biggest amount, 2/3, more than 200 billion euro. And 200 billion euro for Greece, that's more than 100% of GDP. And that shows that the IMF alone, the IMF participated with about 10% in these operations. They couldn't have done it. They don't have so much money for individual countries. That's why we had to create our own institution. But we do work on these lending operations like the IMF with conditionality. Disbursements happen every quarter or every 6 months when agreed reform steps have already been implemented. Today, it's clear that all these 5 programs from EFSF and ESM were success cases. Greece took a bit longer, but in the end, all countries regained market access and had an economic performance that was better than the average of the euro area until the pandemic hit. So until 2019, they really were success cases because they had implemented many reforms, which is also an experience we know from the IMF. Here I want to make an aside because one interesting aspect in the work of my institutions is that we are a regional financial arrangement, a regional line of defense for Europe. We have other regional arrangements like that in other parts of the world. So we call them regional financial arrangements, RFAs. Here in Singapore, we have AMRO that in a way helps the Chiang Mai initiative, giving independent advice on the situation in the ASEAN countries. Chiang Mai initiative, where 240 billion euro is available through swap lines of central banks. That's the Asian response in a way to the Asian debt crisis. We work very closely with AMRO. I visited them 2 days ago. They do a great job in supervision. They don't provide their loans directly. That's done through the Chiang Mai initiative, but the two belong together. We also have the Arab Monetary Fund in the Middle East. We have FLA in Colombia with 15 Latin and South American countries. We have the BRICS for the 5 BRICS countries. So this has become a good network. We all have somewhat different mandates and different tools, but the purpose is the same, to help the region in a crisis. And in that sense, these regional financial arrangements have become an important part of the global financial safety net. And this should show the global financial safety net. Oh, okay, it's coming. The global financial safety net has several layers. The first one are the foreign exchange reserves of central banks. The second one are bilateral currency swap arrangements, and they fluctuate, they go up in a crisis, sometimes disappear otherwise. We have the regional financial arrangements, and then we have the IMF, the International Monetary Fund at the global level. And they together can all help in a crisis to provide liquidity. The combined firepower, lending capacity of the regional financial arrangements is about the same as the lending capacity of the IMF, about $1 trillion US dollar. And therefore, it's important that we work well together among ourselves, but also with the IMF. And we have developed this cooperation greatly over the last 2 years. Well, that's a little aside, but I think maybe interesting for you as you also have AMRO in this city. Moving to the third crisis, the pandemic, and you all will remember that, of course. This third crisis was completely different from the other 2 crises, because the other 2 crises, one could blame policy mistakes, mistakes in bank supervision, long run developments that went in the wrong direction that led to loss in competitiveness in individual countries. All that was not present here. The COVID-19 pandemic was a symmetric shock affecting all countries around the world. There were enormous human costs, over 6 million deaths worldwide due to COVID. It was an unprecedented health crisis during our lifetime. The last comparable one was the Spanish flu in 2018 and 19, which also interestingly lasted about two years before it became less serious. You're all aware of the lockdowns and what it meant for economic activity. And therefore, globally, we had a significant decline in growth, minus 3.1% globally. In the euro area, even minus 6.5% drop in GDP. And global trade was much affected and fell. So very serious economic consequences. What was the policy response? At the macroeconomic level, fiscal measures were unavoidable, and all governments adopted support measures for households, for businesses, supported employment. All that happened at the national level in probably most countries around the world. In Europe, in addition, we had specific programs designed at the European level, which came on top of the national measures. And they were well coordinated with the national measures and also helped the member states to deal with the problem, companies, corporates, and workers. And of course, monetary policy again had to step in with very expansionary policies. Here, and I will not go into details because otherwise I take too much time. You will be able to find this presentation, by the way, on the website of the ESM. So those who are interested to follow more closely, I can also send it to you so you can find it. But it shows how much the euro area did compared to what the United States did. And that's always an interesting comparison. So for households, left-hand side, measures in support of households, the US did a lot and a lot more than the euro area. The lower dark blue part, those were direct payments to households, and the purple one, income support, and that amounted in the US to 9% of GDP roughly. In the euro area, only 3% of GDP. But on the other hand, you see on the right-hand side that we did more in Europe to support companies through direct support, but also a lot through government guarantees. And all that amounted to almost 8% of GDP. In the US, only 5% of GDP. We think that our approach actually worked better because we did not do what the US did, sending checks to households. In the US, for a while, one had a situation where the household income after the beginning of COVID was higher than before, because these checks were quite sizable. Of course, people were happy. It helps to support consumption, and it helps to limit the decline in GDP. But it's a one-off support that doesn't have any positive long-term impact. It can even have a negative impact, and some economists in the US predicted already a year and a half ago that this approach would lead to higher inflation. Like Larry Summers did that. There was a remarkable debate between Larry Summers and Paul Krugman, which was managed by Markus Brunnermeier. And I watched it live. It was quite interesting how two heavyweights among the US economists disagreed very, very strongly in a polite way, but very strongly. And Larry Summers turned out to be right. Inflation today is much higher than the government predicted in early last year. Our approach in Europe was to not only support demand, but also support the supply side of the economy. So we developed a program where at the European level, programs were designed to support public investment and additional reforms in member states of the EU. There was an 800 billion, here it says 750 billion euro, but that's in 2019 prices. So it's basically 800 billion euro. So a big package. Member states can get grants and loans from the European level that helps them to implement reforms, also to finance the transformation towards a green and digital economy. And the money is not dispersed all at once, but over a 5-year period until 2026. And that should have a positive impact on long-term potential growth, and does not lead to the same kind of inflationary problems, although we also have now also high inflation, but not quite as high as the US. So we think that was the right approach. Also, by doing this, it was deliberately decided that countries that suffered most from the pandemic would receive more than their proportional share in these assistance programs. So countries that were damaged, particularly by the pandemic, get more financial support. This shows that actually the pandemic then, with the different measures that were implemented at the national and European level, we recovered fairly quickly. On the left-hand side, the blue line shows how quickly GDP growth came back to trend growth with a clear V-shaped recovery. Compared with the global financial crisis, the yellow line, a much faster rebound. And the right-hand side shows where the European member states were at the end in the fourth quarter of 2021 compared to the fourth quarter of 2019. And more than half the countries were well above their pre-pandemic growth level, GDP level, while a few countries were still lagging behind. So it was overall, I think, quite a successful approach. It was a big crisis, as I said, minus 6.4% GDP dropped, biggest drop since World War II in 1 year, but we got out of it very quickly. And then, as we were hoping that now things will return to normal, and the momentum actually was strong in growth until the 24th of February this year, when the war in Ukraine started. This is having serious economic repercussions around the world, particularly in Europe, because we just happen to be closer to the war. It's our doorstep, very close, a few hundred kilometers away. All countries around the world suffer from the rising energy and food prices, of course. That's a global phenomenon. But on top of that, we have the closeness to the war. People are anxious. Some are afraid. They're afraid that the war might spread to Western Europe. So confidence of consumers and investors has collapsed. Inflation going up. Already now, as a minimum, we expect that growth in Europe will be 2 percentage points lower than what we thought in January of this year. That's according to IMF forecast, European Commission forecast. But there's a lot of uncertainty. Much worse scenarios are possible. It also depends, obviously, how long the war lasts, whether Russia cuts gas exports to Europe. That would lead then clearly to a drop in GDP. World trade is affected. And world trade, of course, there we had not yet full normalization from the pandemic. As you know, in China, there are still lockdowns. Shanghai port is closed to some extent. And therefore, the supply chain problems that appeared during the pandemic are still continuing. And that also affects global trade and GDP growth. There are several transmission mechanisms how our economies will be affected around the world, but Europe more. There's the energy channel, food, the high prices, trade will be less good or even negative compared to expectations. Some banks have exposures in Ukraine and Russia, and there's a confidence effect that might create real problems. I think private investors, many of them are postponing investment projects unless they are really critical for their operation. Europe is also most exposed to Russia. Not surprisingly, it's a neighbor more than the rest of the world. We have a high energy dependency. You see it on the left-hand side. Only Japan is more. It's 90% of their energy is imported, but most European countries also they import between 50 and 80% of their energy. And that means also for economists interesting a big terms of trade loss. Terms of trade means the ratio between export prices, import prices. And Europe is experiencing right now the biggest terms of trade loss in its history. It's worse than what happened during the oil crisis in the early 70s. And the terms of trade loss is something very painful because you transfer part of your wealth to the energy exporters. And we estimate that this is right now 3% of GDP, and that is lost. It cannot be compensated. And that is painful. This is more about where we think GDP might develop, but I think it's enough to understand that growth projections are revised down. Look at the right-hand side. The right-hand side shows how the growth forecast for this year, 2022, looked like starting in December 21, the yellow line. Early this year, they were still at 3.5%, but then starting from February, they are now down to about 2%, while the inflation expectations has been going up from 3% to now 6.5%. So very rapid deterioration in growth, and at the same time, acceleration in inflation. What is the policy response? Of course, we are early on in this, so it's not as developed as in the other crisis. I probably have to come back for another lecture to talk about this in more detail. Monetary policy, unlike in the other crisis, has to tighten now. The other three crises, monetary policy could always loosen. That's not possible now because inflation is so high. We are trying to reduce our dependency on Russian energy. And that's a clear policy priority now, but it takes some time finding new sources of energy, developing more rapidly other sources of energy, green sources, and less reliance on fossil fuel and coal. That was a trend anyway, but we try to accelerate that now. There are the sanctions against the Russian government and Russian companies. You know that. We try very much to support Ukraine, the people, the refugees. There are already 4 million refugees from Ukraine in Western European countries. We are increasing the defense spending in line with NATO commitments. And because economic activity is dropping, there are measures implemented in different EU member states to support households or to reduce energy prices by lowering taxes on gasoline, for instance. So a range of measures, but it's just beginning. We are not at the end of that. At the moment, the fiscal response looks like that, rather small compared to earlier crises, but it may continue to go up. Globally, also higher inflation, and that's a problem in all countries, also here. And in addition to that, what we are trying to do is to develop European integration further in a way that has happened in each of these four crises, particularly during the Euro crisis with new institutions, but already after the global financial crisis with stronger banking supervision. For the monetary union, we are working on remaining gaps in the architecture of the monetary union. This requires another seminar, I think. We try to create a capital markets union, a banking union, and we need more central fiscal capacities to address particular problems. And at the EU level, you may have read the last few weeks' statements from the newly elected French president, Emmanuel Macron, who has talked about the need to develop additional areas of cooperation, not only trade, agriculture, what I mentioned earlier, but also security, defense policy, energy, transport. So really additional areas of cooperation. And Prime Minister Draghi from Italy has also talked about developing a pragmatic federalism, which would mean moving away from decisions by consensus, more to qualified majority. These would be big steps to make the European Union more like one country, like the United States of Europe. They are not easy. They would require a change in the EU treaty, and that is a complicated process, requires ratification in all countries, and some countries also a referendum, which sometimes fails for the wrong reasons. So what I mentioned for the monetary union, that can be done without changing the EU treaty. And we are actually working on these topics, and that would go a long way to make monetary union more resilient. But to move the EU as a whole towards more like a federation of European countries, more difficult political steps and legally difficult steps would need to be taken. But it's on the agenda, and the crisis, which one would prefer not to have, can be very helpful in pushing forward these difficult topics that can ultimately lead to more integration. Thank you very much. I hope I didn't speak too long.
Thank you, Klaus. I mean, fascinating. Well, first of all, the optimism that we end up with, and I cannot but detect that tone of that note of optimism towards the end. And even more striking than that is that that's coming at the tail end of a masterly overview of 4 great crises that has impacted the world really very profoundly. So really wonderful lecture. Thank you very much. We're now open to questions. So again, for those who do want to ask questions, make sure that you turn on the microphone, because just to repeat, all of this is being recorded and we'd like to get your questions on the record as well. So questions? Yes, please. If you like, you can say your name.
Yeah, hi, I'm Shruti. And so I have to ask this. So what do you think was the consequence of Brexit on the European Union? Because when they finally exited in 2021, do you think the effects were diluted within the union or were overshadowed by COVID, which was very much in its high phase at that point? Because particularly I see 2 different consequences. One is that, UK has always blocked specific themes that kind of strengthened the architecture of Europe as a whole. For example, I think the rescue package of 665 or 750 billion euros, or even helping Greece, were both some things that they would have had strong opinions on. While they already opted out of the Greece thing, we wouldn't have known how they would have reacted to the recovery plan. On the other side, we see that labor movement to UK has kind of gone down, and we also see that small businesses are getting affected because initially they didn't need any special, requirements to kind of trade within the UK. So I'm just curious to know what your thoughts are on this. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Brexit, of course, was a very, very important topic a few years ago. And many people, many European bureaucrats had to spend a lot of time on that in the UK, but also in Brussels, to sort out how to do it, because it's not easy. A country that has been a member of the European Union, it's not easy to become a member of the European Union, and then to unwind that is also not easy. And for example, the British government had to create new ministries, new offices, because certain things were done in Brussels on behalf of all the members. So they have not to be done in the capital or to much smaller extent. So not easy technically, but to put it very simple, Brexit is very expensive for the British economy and politically damaging for the EU, because for the EU, of course, we became smaller. So in terms of GDP, economic activity, we lost an important member, also a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. So politically regrettable, but the economic cost is mainly in the UK. For them, the trade with the EU was very, very important. Of course, there are individual companies that were specialized in trading from the continent to the UK. For them, that was also painful. But for the EU as a whole, the trade is not that important. And the trade is shrinking. Some people, Ken Rogoff had an article in the Financial Times yesterday on why inflation in the United Kingdom right now is the highest in all G7 countries. And he also attributed a lot of that to Brexit because they lost access to normal imports from the EU. There are now tariffs on some imports. As you say, it's much more difficult to get a visa in the UK to work there. That means there are many vacancies in many parts of the economy. That also drives up prices. So I think this very general statement, it's very costly for the UK economy. And politically, it's regrettable for the EU that summarize it in a very brief way.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next question.
Very insightful.
Hi, I'm Surya from Indonesia. I just want to ask more about G20. So I think in the last global recession, the GFC, we had quite close coordination between the G20 countries. Do you think it will be repeated again in the current Ukraine crisis? Because as we know, like Russia is like part of the G20. And then, of course, in the central bank, between central banks, there is cooperation, but within fiscal and health authorities, they seem not to coordinate well in the COVID pandemic. So what do you think they will do it again in the current crisis?
Yeah. No, good question coming from Indonesia, because Indonesia is right now the chair of the G20. And I think the G20 was particularly successful during the global financial crisis. As I mentioned briefly, the G20 had existed for a short time before the global financial crisis hit, but only at the level of finance ministers. I attended some of those meetings in the late 90s. But with the global financial crisis, it became a much more important coordination instrument. There were several summits when the global financial crisis hit, and there were real programs adopted by the summits in the years 2008 and 2009, and they met on a regular basis every few months. So that was the heydays of the G20, and they really agreed on a plan how to strengthen the global financial system through better, more comprehensive regulation and supervision. So that was very good. Now, of course, and you say it, Russia is part of the G20, and it's very hard to come to any agreement at the moment. Last month, I was at the IMF spring meeting in Washington, and in the meeting of the IMFC that happens every 6 months, it was not able to agree for the first time in the 70-year history of the IMF to agree on a communique, because communiques can only be adopted by consensus at the IMF. Russia did not agree. All the other countries agreed on a text. Spain has currently the chairmanship there. So it was the first time that it became a chairperson statement, and it was not possible to have a communique because one country did not agree. So as it stands right now, a global cooperation where all important countries are involved is very, very difficult. Let's hope that the war doesn't take too long, and that one can return to a global cooperation where all countries participate. And it will be important, of course, to agree with, to have a multilateral approach with all countries around the world. But in a war, that's difficult.
Thank you. Alfred?
Alfred, faculty here. I work on public finance. So you just mentioned that the Italian Prime Minister talked about pragmatic federalism. But in the meantime, in our public finance, we have a debate about self-enforcing federalism. The reason is we don't want the arrangement to be altered someday. So basically, some sort of argument is, can we actually have a stable central-local relations? It's not actually just handling near-term problem instead of handle long-term problem. So I'm not quite sure whether this debate, pragmatic federalism, has anything to do with this.
It's not well defined yet. It was a speech that Mario Draghi made in front of the European Parliament. But he said we should move to majority voting, which for the EU would be a major, major shift, because at the moment in most important policy areas, decisions can only be taken by consensus, which means every country has a veto right. And that, of course, then makes it more difficult to take quickly steps that might be needed in a crisis. like now, how to respond to the war in Ukraine. It also was not easy during the Euro crisis. The creation of the EFSF and the ESM took also several nights of summits, deliberations before they could come to a conclusion. I have also been in many meetings that went through the night. Whenever it gets difficult, that happens with qualified majority, or it doesn't happen at all in the end, because one or two countries may veto. So qualified majority voting would help a lot. I don't think there will be agreement anytime soon to have a kind of well, there is an EU budget. I didn't talk about that earlier. There is an EU budget that's relatively small, 1% of the GDP of the European Union. So to think of something like the United States, where out of the total government, federal and states, the federal government has something like 15 to 20% of GDP, a budget, the rest is at the state level. I don't think we will move towards that in any time soon. So as soon as money is involved, the member states of the European Union will look very carefully that they preserve their national sovereignty. They were prepared during the pandemic to add a significant amount of money to the normal EU budget, so the normal 1% of GDP per year. That's around 130 billion a year. So they added this 800 billion package on top of that. So that was a big amount in response to the crisis. So in a crisis, this may happen, but I don't expect an EU budget that's comparable to the United States. Maybe a little bit bigger, depending on which of these areas that Draghi and Macron talked about might be shifted to the EU level. I could well envisage that there's more cooperation on defense policies, because most experts, and I am not an expert on defense, but experts agree that the same amount of money could be spent much more efficiently if this were done together. Because right now every country has its own procurement rules, and if that could be done at the EU level, so one could imagine that the EU budget moves from 1% of GDP to 2% of GDP to spend 1% of GDP on defense, would still leave some defense expenditures at the national level, but a large part could be done at the EU level. Maybe also one could have a bit more money on energy, on defending the common borders of the Schengen Agreement. So small steps there, but on the budget side, I would not expect a big step. So there we are quite a bit away from the situation that you find in the US.
Thank you. We've just about run out of time, but if someone has a final burning question, observation to ask Klaus while he's here. Otherwise, I would just invite you to join me in thanking Klaus for a really wonderful, enlightening, informative overview of crises, the emergence of a new European Union, greater integration, and actually a wonderful note of optimism in the midst of the crises-ridden world that we are in. Thank you very much, Klaus, and thank you, audience, for all your attention.